Chapter 3. Please sit down, Peter Tembisa said. Constance sat down. They had already exchanged greetings. Peter Tembisa's office was large. It was on an upper floor, and through the large windows there was an excellent view of the city. There were comfortable chairs, a corner where a drinks cabinet stood, and a small refrigerator which hummed discreetly in the background. "I'm sorry I couldn't see you before now," Peter said. "That's okay," Constance replied, smiling. "I know how busy you are." "And you?" he asked me. "Yes, you," Peter repeated. "Are you being kept busy? Do you want a polite answer? Or the truth?" "Can't I have both?" Peter asked Constance, smiling again. "Or have you been a lawyer so long that you can tell truth from lies?" "The truth is," Constance told him, sighing gently, "the truth is I'm not being stretched enough. Wouldn't you agree?" Peter Tembisa scratched the side of his nose. It was something he often did when he was thinking carefully. He was the kind of man who measures his words before speaking, especially before answering a question. As a lawyer, with many years' experience, he knew the dangers of speaking without proper care and thought, "You must understand, Constance. You have to walk before you can run." "Sure," Constance replied immediately, "but right now I'm not even walking, am I? She gives me tasks, she." Peter Tembisa was no longer smiling. "Mrs. Maribi," Constance corrected herself. And thought, the old dragon. She isn't treating me properly. I want to be open about this. "Yes, let's discuss this openly," Peter Tembisa agreed. "Mrs. Maribi tells me that you were very rude to her and that's a lie." Constance interrupted. Mr. Tembisa looked at her over the top of his glasses, sternly, like a father, or perhaps a schoolteacher. Constance bit her lower lip. She wished she had not interrupted him. "When would she learn to control her tongue?" "Mrs. Maribi says that you refused to obey an instruction. She says that you argued with her. And which she particularly objects to you opposed her when others were present, other members of staff." "Anything else?" Constance asked. Does Mrs. Maribi accuse me of anything else?" Peter Tembisa had papers in front of him. He lifted the top sheet. He read very quickly. He stopped about halfway down the second sheet. "Mrs. Maribi feels strongly enough about this to put her points down on paper. For the record," Constance said, her voice sounding bitter. "Mrs. Maribi wanted a proper record of everything to do with the argument earlier in the week to be used against Constance on a later occasion, perhaps." "Tembisa and Associates are in business, Constance," Peter said. He removed his glasses, placed them on the table, and rubbed his eyes. "We are successful because, well, do you know the reasons for our success?" "I think so," Constance replied, keeping her voice low. Peter Tembisa was being clever. He was going to let Constance recite the reasons for the company's success, and then show her, or allow her to recognize, that her own responses were not contributing to that success. "Then tell me," he said to her. Constance took a deep breath. She had entered Peter Tembisa's office determined to tell him exactly what she thought of Mrs. Maribi and her foolish little tasks, and to explain that she might be young and she might lack experience, but there were other law firms that would give her employment. And if Mrs. Maribi did not know that, then someone ought to tell her. Yet here she was being urged by her employer to give the reasons for the success of the company. There was doubt on that score. Tembisa and Associates was a successful business. There were several reasons, but perhaps the most important one was Peter himself. He had always worked hard. He had intelligence mixed with common sense. He got on well with many people. That explained, in part, why he gained work from people in all groups within the city. Unlike some other legal firms, Tembisa and Associates did not get work from one racial group only. Peter knew the importance of attracting a range of clients. He also knew that it was important to give the very best service to clients, so that they would come again if they needed help. In addition, because they were well treated, they would be happy to recommend the company to their friends. Good management policies are also important. A company must know how to treat its staff well. Peter Tembisa was popular with his staff, and who do you think is central to all this? Peter asked. Do you know, Constance? You, of course, Constance replied, without hesitation. And she might have added that this was a foolish question to ask, because everyone knew how important the founder and managing director himself was to the firm. No, not me, Peter replied. Then who? Constance asked him, puzzled. Surely, she thought, he isn't going to say junior members of the firm like me, fresh out of university. If he said that, she would be convinced he was lying. Make no mistake about it, Constance. The center of all this business, or any other successful law firm, is the chief clerk. Mrs. Maribi. In the case of our company, yes, Mrs. Maribi. But she isn't even qualified, Constance said. And added, I think that's part of the trouble. Trouble? Peter asked, seizing on that single word as he might do when questioning a thief or a murderer in a court of law. Yes, Constance replied. She isn't legally qualified herself, and she resents. She's jealous of those who are. At least, when they are young and when they are female. Is that what you really think? Peter asked gently. He had discovered many years ago, as a young man learning how to be successful in court, that a soft voice was better than the voice of a bully. Well, don't you? Constance asked. She lacked his experience, but she knew well enough that sometimes it is a good tactic to answer a question by asking another one. I know that Mrs. Maribi is a first-class chief clerk. Every firm needs one. Constance smiled. Why do you smile, Constance? Peter asked her. I see now why you are a successful lawyer, Constance replied. She was referring to the fact that he had not even tried to answer her question, and he believed that she had not noticed. And he said, stroking the side of his nose once again, I can see why one day you will perhaps become a very successful lawyer. But yes. Constance asked quietly. First, you have a lot to learn. Teach me, Constance replied, almost cheekily. I'm very willing to learn. I'm sure you are, Peter Tembisa answered. Constance took her chance, but I can't learn while I'm wasting my time on trivial tasks that could be done by a typist, or a secretary, or almost anyone. Yes. Peter said. Your original quarrel with Mrs. Maribi. That's why you asked me in here, Constance said. We have to talk about it, don't we? There was a boldness in her speech that some might have thought was rudeness, but which Constance believed was necessary if men were going to accept her for her worth, and not treat her simply as a woman. Have you no fear, girl? Peter asked suddenly. This question took Constance by surprise, but she recovered very quickly. She was already the sort of young person who is able to think fast. As one of her lecturers at the university used to say, a good lawyer learns to think fast on his or her feet. Which meant they must respond at speed to surprises, to trick questions, to new developments. That was one factor that separated a good lawyer from a very good one. What have I to fear? Constance asked, and she smiled fearlessly as she gave her reply. She looked Peter Tembisa straight in the eye. This was certainly not the way that she had been brought up by her mother and her grandparents. They had taught her to respect people by not looking them directly in the eye, especially an older man. Well, Constance thought, that was fine in the old days, when women and girls were considered second class when compared with men. But now we live in the modern age, where men and women are equal, no matter what age, what race or color, what creed, faith, or position. Equal respect for all people. That was the way forward. The new society was a place for people with confidence, not a place for fear. I fear nothing, Constance said, and she was still looking straight in her employer's eyes as he spoke the words, "Not even losing your job?" Peter asked. Constance felt great disappointment. This sounded like a threat. It surely was a threat, and she did not think that a person like Peter Tembisa would lower himself to issue such threats. Mrs. Maribi, yes, but not Peter Tembisa himself. Suddenly, he went down in her estimation. Constance sighed and shrugged her shoulders. "I can always get another post," she said. "I'm sorry if my plain speaking has led to this." "Led to what?" he asked. "Threats." Constance replied, "I'm not threatening you, my dear dash." "It sounded like a threat to me," Constance interrupted him. Peter Tembisa turned to another sheet of paper on the desk and picked it up. "Mrs. Maribi has recommended that dash. How dare she?" Constance shouted, interrupting yet again. "Just because I tell her the truth, she—" "Wait a moment, Constance," Peter said. No, I won't. It's about time you knew. Mrs. Maribi may once have been a good chief clerk when times were different. You know that better than I do. But now, well, she's got very little understanding of how to deal with members of staff, how to talk to people in an acceptable way. She knows nothing about modern methods. There are new ideas about office and personnel management. Mrs. Maribi doesn't know this. And you do?" Peter asked gently. The quietness of his approach was very different from her anger. I don't know everything. I admit that. But that woman knows even less than I do. And now she has the cheek to ask you to fire me. Did I say that?" Peter asked. There was on his lips a look that was almost a look of amusement. It was almost as if he was enjoying her anger. "Well, isn't she?" Constance asked, and she pointed at the report that Mrs. Maribi had written. Peter Tembisa reached over the desk and took hold of her hand. Constance withdrew quickly. She would decide when she was going to be touched. These men. Did they know nothing? Had they no understanding of the modern world? "Mrs. Maribi has not recommended that you be fired. She has, however, reported you for the incident where you refused to." "I agreed in the end," Constance said. "Please let me finish, Constance," Peter told her, his voice polite but strong. "Sorry," Constance mumbled, feeling very unhappy. "You're not the first member of staff Mrs. Maribi has reported to me. And I doubt that you'll be the last." He paused briefly and looked out of the window. In the distance it was possible to see the large mounds of waste that had been produced in the early days of mining in the city. "Mrs. Clark wants you to find her son." "Yes, she asked me," Constance replied. "Mrs. Maribi has suggested that you be given a few days out of the office. To find Daniel." "Is that his name?" "Yes," Constance replied. "Are you willing to do so?" Peter Tembisa asked her, "Do I have a choice?" Constance said, "Of course you do," Peter told her. "Mrs. Maribi isn't quite the old dragon that you young people think, you know." Constance smiled with amusement. Quite clearly Peter knew the nickname Mrs. Maribi had been given by younger members of staff one could do with a little time out of the office. "In the fresh air," Constance agreed. "Good," Peter Tembisa said. He glanced at his wristwatch. There was other, more important work for him to get on with. Constance stood up. "One last point." "Go ahead," Peter told her. "I was rude to Mrs. Maribi." "I agree. But I also told her I was sorry. I'd like that to be written in the record too. And I did agree to do the work. I've already met Mrs. Clark." "Look, Constance, as far as I'm concerned, any argument you had with Mrs. Maribi is now, well, it's history. I shall not refer to it again. Just try to think very carefully before you speak. Especially when you're speaking to Mrs. Maribi. She may be getting a bit out of touch." "Yes," Constance agreed. "Take Ndlovu with you," Peter said. "He can be very useful. And he'll be company for you." That's a very good idea, Constance replied. Thank you. He was useful last time. Don't thank me, Peter said. Thank Mrs. Maribi.